Greetings, Intertubers, and welcome to Art and Sound in Time. I'm one of your hosts, Thomas Johansson.
And I am your other host, Catherine Mandy Cat Duffy.
And on today's show, we are over-prepared.
Yay!
Last week...
Finally, our neuroses come in handy.
Yes. Last week for our inaugural show, or previously on our inaugural show, we basically just looked at portraits of composers and said, Beethoven needs to smile more.
Yeah, we were looking at paintings, but then it kind of devolved into just looking at photographs and making fun of various composers' facial hair, which you will still expect on this show. So don't get too comfortable. This is educational and informational.
Yeah, we're very juvenile.
And also kind of mean-spirited towards the dead. So our apologies. We apologize to our friends and family and anyone who knew Beethoven personally. I'm sure he was a real sweetie.
We apologize if you were offended in any way.
Yes. Actually, that should probably be our sign-off.
Yeah, that's good.
Have a great day, and we apologize if you were offended in any way.
Much better than don't drive like my brother.
That would offend your brother.
Yes. Although, to be fair, have you seen his driving?
I haven't firsthand.
Anyhow.
So yes, today we are talking about artist collectives and composer collectives.
Yeah, so which collective will we be discussing first?
Well, I need to preface this by saying that there are hundreds and probably hundreds and hundreds of various collectives of artists in time. I kind of handled the art section today, and art gets really clumpy. It gets very autocorrelated, and we like to see that, of course, but it happens a lot that artists kind of group together and inspire one another, and it makes sense. We say that art doesn't exist in a vacuum, but a good artist kind of creates one, and it lures other art towards it, and you kind of end up with these really cool movements of artists inspiring one another and really moving forward and sideways and backwards and always twirling.
Twirling towards freedom.
Yes, exactly. Because there are so many groups of musicians and composers and artists, we cannot get to all of them. I have a small list of honorable mentions towards the end because I love everyone. But I only decided to touch on artists that affected me personally. So sorry if they seem really arbitrary. They kind of are. That's my view on artists that I picked. How about you, composer-wise? Thomas?
It's similar. I can't say that all of the groups that I'm talking about have had that huge of an effect on me, although they're the ones that I know the most about. So I'm just kind of sticking to what I know best in this instance.
You're going the historically significant route.
To a degree, yes. One thing I will say, I think it's a little bit different when it comes to composing. Composing is a solitary task, and we do seek out other composers, other like-minded people to share our music with and to try and find support with, and hopefully corral some musicians with. But yeah, you don't find as many composing collectives, I don't think, as you would in the visual arts realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think that a studio full of composers sounds terrifying. Sitting at their desks and occasionally humming to themselves.
Yeah, it's not like, you can get a group of artists together to all paint the same model. But if you get a group of composers to compose around the same model all at once...
It sounds horrific.
It's going to be a bit frantic. Even John Cage would probably leave the room after about 3 minutes.
And that is saying a lot because he can take quite a bit of noise. Well, my group of painters starts at 1863. I have a group that I actually studied quite extensively in my master's called the Peredvizhniki, which is the Russian word for wanderers or the itinerants. This is a group of Russian realist artists, and they broke away from the Imperial Academy of Arts because the rules were too constraining. They are really, really cool. They were called the Wanderers because they were kind of giving mobile exhibitions all over Russia, and they were giving people in Russian provinces an idea of how art at the time was moving. They brought art to the people, and they also painted the people, the common people and social urban life at the time. But yeah, not everybody could obviously make it to Moscow and St. Petersburg, or as we would call it in Scotland, St. Petersburg. I don't think that's
I don't think that would fly
no, I
in
don't
St.
think so.
Petersburg.
But obviously, I mean, Russia is huge, so they couldn't, not everybody, especially not people who are like farmers, or
Right.
not everybody could make it that far because Russia's really big. So they had, I think it was something like 48 or 50 mobile exhibitions, just setting them up in towns and things and showing their spectacular works. They followed really liberal philosophers, Belinsky, and I've got the other one written down because I don't remember it, Chernyshevsky.
Yes.
They fought against censorship and serfdom and capital punishment, and in the same way that they were bringing art to the common people, they were showing the beauty of everyday life and people of Russia, and they depicted things like poverty and everyday life. I mean, obviously they brought up social justice, but they also talked about the joys and the beauty of everyday life. There's a painting by Serov. Oh, I want to say his first name was Valentin Serov. It's called The Girl with the Peaches. And it's just a girl. I saw it first in I think that it was in Minnesota, actually, at the Russian Art Gallery. I could be wrong, but I think that there was a traveling exhibition. It was The Girl with the Peaches, and she's just sitting at a table with peaches, and she's beautiful, and the colors in her face, she just glows. It's just incredible. So yeah, they were around the 1860s, maybe a little bit going into a little bit later. Notable artists are Isaac Levitan and Ivan Shishkin, both of those well-known landscape painters, and they're well-known in the atelier as well. I think that Shishkin was kind of the big deal because he had a little bit more tight work. But also some of my favorite artists like Ilya Repin. Oh, I love Ilya Repin. You know that I love Ilya Repin.
Oh, yes. Yes. It's hard not to love Ilya Repin.
It's hard not to love Ilya Repin. I think that if we wrote a book about him, that's what it would be titled. Kramskoy, and actually one of my favorite artists, Emily Shanks, who is the first woman to be elected as a full member. She did this painting in 1892 called New Girl at School, and I'm sure we're probably showing it right now.
Yeah.
It's just, oh, it just glows. I'm just, oh, I can't,
Oh, yeah.
I just want to stare at it for ages. All of their paintings, though, they're so realistic, but they're not realistic in a photograph way.
They breathe life.
Yes, they breathe life. That's what I've been looking to say. Yeah, the skin, and I get a little caught up with the skin because they do such a good job. Those are the first people where, you zoom in and or you look up close and you see greens and crazy pinks and purples, and they all just come together to create just this incredible effect of light on skin. So yeah, I'm a little obsessed with the Peredvizhniki. I think that's about 10 minutes spent on them. But yeah, I'm sorry. So, what was going on around that time in music?
In music around the same time and the same location, we have the Mighty Handful. Let me try and get the Russian pronunciation here. The Mogudchaya Kuchka.
That's very nice.
This is a group of composers that met starting around the late 1850s, early 1860s. The leader of the group was Mili Balakirov. Other notable members included Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Alexander Borodin. Not so notable member, Cesar Cui rounds out the group. He was the
Oh, poor Kui.
he was the pinky of the group, I have to say.
The pinky of the group. Oh.
Yeah,
Say, Balakirev, what are we going to do tonight?
same thing we do every night, Caesar.
Compose nationalistic music.
That's right. And I think it's worth noting that the middle of the 19th century, nationalism was all the rage throughout Europe, and every country was trying to assert its national identity. And there was at this time Greece and a few other smaller countries were actually under the thumb of larger nations, and there were movements to emancipate them, to allow them to become their own nations, and it was mainly from this driving nationalistic force. And Russia, unfortunately, has kind of this split personality. It's both ruled for many centuries by the Tartars, the Khanate, with the remnants of Genghis Khan's empire. And it also has this whole Western bent that really kind of started with Alexander the Great and Catherine the Great. And so it's kind of this mishmash of European and Asian cultural identities. And of course, it's so huge too. The sun sets on one side of Russia while it's rising on the other. That's how big geographically it is. So to create a single nationalistic identity for it was really difficult, and perhaps still isn't done today. But that was kind of the aim of the five. They wanted to create very Russian music. They didn't want to be beholden to the German methods that were so prevalent at the time. Most of, yeah, actually, all of the composers in the Mighty Five were largely self-taught. At least as composers, they might have had musical training elsewhere, but as composers, they taught themselves as opposed to like Tchaikovsky or Glazunov. And in addition to that, they all had professions outside of music. For example, Borodin was a chemist and also a huge women's rights activist.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea.
Yeah, I just found out about that too today.
And Mussorgsky was a professional alcoholic too.
Yeah, that took a lot out of his time. He probably would have written another dozen operas if not for the booze.
It kept him occupied.
Yeah, most of them were affiliated with civil service or the army. Rimsky-Korsakov was in the Navy. And so, yeah, they just kind of collected and would work on creating a Russian musical identity for themselves as a legacy for the nation.
That's so cool. Should we talk about Tchaikovsky a little bit? I mean, he was around during the same time, and we should probably talk about the relationship between the five and Tchaikovsky.
Well, there wasn't too much of a relationship between them. There wasn't even that bitter of a feud between them. They kind of set themselves as opposites, but it wasn't necessarily, from what I can see, it wasn't really an us versus them knockdown dragout or anything like that. It was mainly just
Oh.
Tchaikovsky was part of the elite. He was one of the conservatory composers, and these other guys were all self-taught. So it was just this natural high and low culture conflict, I guess. You see the same thing between very learned, very intelligent rock stars like Radiohead. And how do they compare to Beethoven, who's some sort of god figure in the minds of most classical music listeners? They're at least equals in their own rights, as far as I'm concerned.
Radiohead and Beethoven?
Oh, yeah.
You know, actually, I could see that.
Yeah.
Innovative, changing games.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, how would you characterize the music of the five? I mean, they were trying really hard to make their music authentically Russian. Do you know what authentically Russian ended up becoming?
Okay, this is where I can compare and contrast with Tchaikovsky. When Tchaikovsky would go about setting a Russian folk tune, he would heavily edit the folk tune to try and make it fit to classical standards. That means if the original tune had all sorts of irregular meters, or if it ended in a key other than the one that it started in, Tchaikovsky would move things around, shuffle things so it would actually fit the classical standard, where you have a tonic that you begin and end in, and you're staying pretty much 3/4 throughout, pretty much 4/4 meter throughout. The big five were more prone to just set the folk tunes as they were, warts and all. They also incorporated some not necessarily distinctly Russian elements, but they would incorporate things like parallel fifths and heterophony, and the big thing is the octatonic scale. Rimsky-Korsakov loved using the octatonic scale. It's this pattern of alternating minor seconds and major seconds, so you end up with 8 notes covering the octave as opposed to 7.
Neat. Anything else you want to say about the five? Because I was a huge fan too.
I would say notable works. One that you might not know about that's worth checking out is Borodin's In the Steppes of Central Asia.
In the Steppes of Central Asia.
Yes.
I don't know if I've ever heard that piece.
You probably have and didn't know the title of it, but it's so characteristic of the Big Five and what they were about. It's this lovely. It's essentially landscape interpreted into music, and
I already love it.
Yeah, it reminds me of Debussy's The Sea. It reminds me of Debussy's The Sea in that it's just this very picturesque music. It doesn't really have a lot of dramatic tension, but at the same time, it allows your mind to wander and evoke just what do the steppes of Central Asia look like.
It's so cool. Songs that we might have heard from the five.
There's Mussorgsky's
Oh,
Pictures at an
yeah.
Exhibition, which you've heard the Ravel orchestration of that.
We'll probably end up doing a whole episode on that
Oh yeah.
because there are just so many pieces.
Rimsky-Korsakov, he wrote Scheherazade, which is this huge,
Hmm.
wonderful symphonic suite. Mussorgsky also did a few operas on Russian themes, including Boris Godunov
Oh, right, yeah.
and Night on the Bald Mountain.
Ba 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 ba. I want to just make sure that we have it just in case we don't put background music into this.
Yes.
It's the one that sounds like that, guys. Also, I'm a singer. Ho. So, around that same time, gonna move it over towards France to the Barbizon School. I like the Barbizon School because they were some of the first people in France to go outside. It's named after Barbizon, France. They were inspired by the English painter John Constable. John Constable, who's one of my favorite. He's not Okay, his paintings aren't my favorite paintings, but he is one of my favorite painters because he was one of the very first painters to go outside and paint what he saw. And if you see his paintings, they're so different to the paintings that came before them because they really look like they have the effect of natural light. Like he really tried to make things look like what they look like in real life. John Constable had a show in 1824 at the Salon de Berry, and his works were so realistic, and because they were taken directly from nature, that he inspired an entire art movement in France towards, well, in Barbizon, France anyway, towards realism. And there aren't, and my apologies to any descendants of the Barbizon school, but there aren't too many notable painters in the Barbizon school. Theodore Rousseau, Jules Deprez, Jean-Baptiste Corot, and Corot was a huge role in getting the Impressionists started. He was kind of a prototype Impressionist, but the Barbizon School is really important because as painters, they inspired, and because they were in France, they inspired the French Impressionist movement.
Well, let's discuss that in French Impressionist movement then.
Oh, yeah. Impressionism was kind of neat in France because it was applied to two things that happened at different times.
Hmm. We won't be talking too much about the second use of the term. We're going to focus on art, really.
I'd kind of like to hear about the Impressionist composers beforehand. Now, I've heard rumors, but would the Impressionist composers get upset with me if I called them that?
If they were alive to take offense, yes, they would probably do so.
Sorry, guys.
Thankfully, you can use the term without any repercussions. Yeah, you don't have to worry about Debussy attacking you in the press for using the term impressionist to describe his music. The term was used to describe their music, mostly Debussy, but Ravel kind of gets lumped in there too sometimes. It gets used to describe Debussy's music in part because his music just had this wash of sound a lot of times, especially things like clouds or the sea. There's no real dramatic tension. He kind of set himself as an opponent to Wagner and all of the really heavy on development, high fiber music that was going on in Germany at the time.
I like high fiber music.
Hmm.
I've never heard that term before. I like it.
Yeah, so yeah, Debussy just wrote this kind of ethereal music in a way. It just kind of floats and doesn't really develop in the way that music, according to the Germans and the people who ran the French conservatoire, really felt that it should.
Hmm.
But at the same time, he didn't like to be called Impressionist because he felt he was doing something more substantial than just leaving an impression. He didn't feel his works were unfinished, which is where the term Impressionism really comes from.
Yeah, well, I don't want to jump away from the Impressionists yet, but I want to quick talk about where the word Impressionism came from. Impressionism actually was applied to some French artists that I'll talk about in a jiff here. Monet did a painting in 1872 called Impression Soleil Levant, or Impression Sunrise. And this art critic, Louis Leroy, picked it up and he said, yep, that's what it is. It's an impression. It's not a finished piece. It's just an impression. And I have this amazing quote that he wrote when he was critiquing this exhibition. It says, wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape.
Oh.
So when you think about it in that light, I could see why Debussy would be a bit upset having that word applied to him.
And yet, strangely enough, the Impressionist artists kind of embraced the term, did they not?
Oh, they loved it. They kind of
Mm-hmm.
they appropriated it for themselves. But yeah, sorry, back to composers. Do we miss anything? We got Debussy, Ravel.
That's essentially it. There are other composers who kind of drew an influence from the Impressionist movement. According to Wikipedia, that includes even John Sibelius, though I don't really hear much Impressionism in his music.
Sibelius and Impressionism. See, that's why you don't get your information from Wikipedia, folks.
Yeah.
I mean, I did, mostly, but
We're amateurs. We can get away with this stuff.
we are, yeah. Between us, we only have 2 master's degrees. Oh. So, even though they weren't huge fans of the terms impressionism, would you say that there are overarching characteristics of impressionism as a musical movement?
I would say a focus on mood and atmosphere as opposed to dramatic tension. It's kind of your that's kind of your hallmark right there.
No octatonic scales?
No octatonic. Debussy would play around with whole tone scales, which creates an atmosphere of uncertainty, and but it's a little more, I want to say more relaxed, but that's not quite the right word for it.
It's elusive ambiguity, as our composition professor Thomas Wagren would have put it.
Yeah, I would say the whole tone scale is not quite as strident as the octatonic. That's probably the best way to put it. And they would also go for pentatonic scales, like just using the black keys on the piano, for instance, will get you a pentatonic scale. And that's one that no matter which note you hit, it's going to fit because there's no real dissonance between any two notes of the
Hmm.
pentatonic scale.
No halftones.
That's right. No halftones, no tritones.
In almost the same way, from an abstract sense, and I think it's because the paintings came first.
Hmm.
The Impressionists were kind of retrospectively linked with one another. And by Impressionists in art, I'm talking about, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it in French, but the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers in France between like the 1870s and I think around like 1920s, around that area. The Academy of Beaux Arts, or some people say Beaux Arts, in France was rather conservative at the time, and after being rejected from the Academy of Beaux Arts because of their evolving styles, artists like Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and Alfred Sisley organized this collective so that they could still learn from one another without having to be constrained by rules of the time.
Hmm.
And yeah, their first exhibition was in 1874. It got kind of mixed reviews. I mean, generally in the papers, it was looked down upon because it said, well, these, they're great starts, but where's the detail? Where's the, this is so strange, the lights and stuff. But because of the movements that happened beforehand, the effect of light was so profound that it looked like somebody had just punched a hole through the wall so that you could just see actual real life outside. I mean, not all of them, of course. A
Hmm.
lot of the impressions, particularly Monet, they really like to push color. And Renoir, of course, I mean, you've seen his figures there. I wouldn't necessarily say that they are completely realistic, but at the same time, the reason why they embraced the impressionist term was because they really did just give you the impression, like just how the light hit your retina. Yeah, they were later joined by some of my favorite painters, including Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt is one of my favorite painters. She's incredible. Two paintings of hers that I really, really like, and I couldn't choose between them for notable paintings. One is Young Woman in Green, and we're showing it right now, so I don't have to.
You don't have to choose.
Exactly. It's not. It's just, it's so beautiful. And the other painting, Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. And I think that Little Girl in a Blue Armchair is just so delightful because it's so perfect. She's just such a kid and she just looks exhausted from posing all day and so frustrated. And she just wants to go out and play. And she can't because she's wearing a cute little dress and she has to like be quiet and still so that Mary Cassatt could paint her. Other notable painters, Baudin, Manet, Morisot, Degas, Degas was, of course, ended up being very, very famous because of his paintings of ballerinas.
Hmm.
Yeah, just full of light.
I just gotta drop this little factoid, and again, this comes from Wikipedia, so don't believe me for a second. But I'm just gonna quote right out of the article here. After Emperor Napoleon III saw the rejected works of 1863, he decreed that the public be allowed to judge the work themselves, and the Salon of the Refused was organized. While many viewers came only to laugh, the Salon of the Refused drew attention to the existence of a new tendency in art and attracted more visitors than the regular salon. So Monet, Renoir, they really owe their careers to Napoleon III.
To Napoleon III.
Yeah,
And I think that the moral of that story is that it pays to fail, folks. You don't have to be the best artist, you just need to be the most popular.
right.
I just got really sad just now.
It's okay.
So, we've realized upon sharing all of the information that we know and some that we don't, that we have made this recording pretty long. So, we're splitting it up into two episodes. So, yeah, we'll see you next time when we talk about the Viennese. Wait, the second Oh, crap. Hold on.
We will see you next time
We'll
when we talk about the Second Viennese School.
Yes, also, we're very sorry if we offended anyone.